The year is 1488. A chill wind whips through the highest tower of Chateau de Nantes. 12-year-old Anne of Brittany stands at the cold stone windowsill, her small hands gripping the rough surface until her knuckles ache. Below, the banners of enemy armies, like a plague of locusts, stretch across the Breton countryside. The acrid smell of smoke from burning villages drifts on the wind, and in the distance, the faint, sickening clash of steel on steel echoes. This is not how queens are supposed to be made. Anne presses her face against the glass, her breath fogging the pain as she watches her world crumble. The weight of a duchy, an entire people, rests on shoulders that should be carrying nothing heavier than a child's concerns. But childhood ended for Anne the moment her father's labored breathing stopped echoing through these same stone halls. Now she is Duchess of Brittany, the last hope of a proud Celtic nation, and powerful men across Europe are already deciding her fate, like merchants haggling over a prized mare. She doesn't know it yet, but she will be forced to marry 3 times. She will endure at least 14 pregnancies, watching child after child slip away like morning mist. She will be passed from one conqueror to another, each marriage a political shackle disguised as a golden crown. This is the story of how a little girl became perhaps the most tragic queen in European history, and how she somehow found the strength to fight back. To understand Anne's tragedy, you have to understand what Brittany was and what it meant to lose it. Picture a land where ancient Celtic traditions still whispered through oak groves, where the Breton language flowed like honey on the tongues of fishermen and farmers. A land where proud dukes had ruled independently for centuries, while the rest of Europe shifted like sand around them. Brittany was the last free Celtic nation, a stubborn thorn in the side of an expanding French kingdom. When Anne's father, Duke Francis II, died in 1488, he left behind no male heirs, only 2 daughters, with Anne the elder. In a world where women were considered property to be traded, inherited, or conquered, this was both Anne's curse and her opportunity. The moment news of Francis's death reached the royal courts of Europe, the vultures began circling. King Charles VIII of France, barely older than Anne herself, saw an opportunity to finally absorb Brittany into his growing empire. The Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian, the last knight, viewed her as a potential pawn in his endless chess game. With France, meanwhile, Anne stood in her father's tomb, tears streaming down her face, unknowing that powerful men were already drawing up marriage contracts with her name on them. At 13, Anne made her first desperate move. In a secret ceremony that would have been considered treasonous by the French court, she married Maximilian by proxy. The emperor wasn't even present. A stand-in held Anne's trembling hand as she spoke vows to a man she'd never met, in a language she barely understood. It was a political alliance, masquerading as a marriage, designed to give Brittany the protection of the Holy Roman Empire against French aggression. But Anne had underestimated the ruthlessness of teenage kings. Charles VIII of France was not about to let his prize slip away to a Habsburg emperor. In 1491, French armies swept across Brittany like a plague of iron and fire. They moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine, capturing fortress after fortress, cutting off supply lines, and slowly tightening the noose around Anne's neck. Imagine the scene: a 15-year-old girl standing on the battlements of Rennes, watching the French banners multiply on the horizon like a deadly rash. Her advisors spoke in hushed, urgent tones behind her, but their words blurred into meaningless noise. The reality was stark and brutal. Brittany could not win this war. The French had more men, more gold, more time. Anne's proxy marriage too. Maximilian had proven to be nothing more than a paper shield against a very real sword. The siege of Rennes lasted months. Inside the city, food grew scarce, and Anne could hear the distant thunder of French cannons testing the walls. She must have wondered if Maximilian would come to her aid, if the promised armies of the Holy Roman Empire would appear on the horizon, like salvation. They never came. In the brutal game of European politics, Anne was discovering that promises, made to teenage girls, were worth less than the parchment they were written on. By winter, the choice was clear: surrender or watch her people starve. Anne chose surrender, but Charles VIII's terms were savage. Not only would she have to renounce her marriage to Maximilian, but she would have to marry Charles himself, the conqueror demanding the conquered as his bride. It was a pattern as old as warfare itself. On December 6, 1491, Anne stood in the cathedral of Langay, her hands shaking as she placed them in Charles's. She was barely 16, and he was 21. The ceremony was magnificent. Cloth of gold, precious stones, hundreds of witnesses. But Anne's eyes were hollow. She was signing the death warrant of Breton independence, and she knew it. The marriage contract was particularly cruel. It stipulated that if Charles died before Anne, she would be required to marry his successor. She wasn't just becoming a queen. She was becoming a hereditary asset of the French crown, to be passed from one king to the next, like a prized jewel. The girl who had once stood defiantly in the towers of Nantes was now legally forbidden from ever escaping. French control. Their wedding night was a study in royal brutality disguised as ceremony. Charles, barely out of his teens himself, was not known for his gentleness. Anne, raised in the comparative freedom of the Breton court, was unprepared for the harsh realities of French royal marriage. What happened in that ornate bedchamber was not love. It was conquest in its most intimate form. But Anne was stronger than anyone imagined. Within months, she was pregnant. The French court celebrated, envisioning an heir to secure the union of Brittany and France. Anne must have felt a complex mixture of emotions. Hope that this child might give her some measure of power. Fear for what carrying a conqueror's child meant for her soul, and the devastating knowledge that she was now trapped forever. The child was born dead. This would become the pattern of Anne's life. Hope followed by crushing loss. Pregnancy followed by grief. In the medieval world, infant mortality was common, but Anne's losses were extraordinary even by the standards of the time. She would endure at least 14 documented pregnancies, with most ending in miscarriage, stillbirth, or infant death. Imagine the psychological toll. Each pregnancy brought the possibility of securing her position, of giving France the heir it desperately wanted, of proving her worth in a world that measured royal women by their ability to produce sons. Each loss was not just personal grief, but political failure. Another mark against her in the ruthless ledger of royal expectations. Charles, meanwhile, was proving to be as ineffective as a ruler as he was callous as a husband. He became obsessed with his claim to the throne of Naples, spending vast sums on Italian military campaigns while neglecting the governance of his own kingdom. Anne found herself effectively ruling France while Charles played at being a conqueror in foreign lands. It was ironic. She was gaining real political power, just as her personal life was becoming a catalogue of losses. It was during one of these Italian adventures that fate intervened in the most unexpected way. Short musical interlude. A sense of turning point in 1498. Charles VIII was walking through the galleries of the Château d'Amboise when he struck his head on a low doorway. He collapsed immediately and died within hours. The king who had forced Anne into marriage was dead at 27, leaving behind no surviving children. Anne was free, but only for a moment. According to the terms of her marriage contract, she was now required to marry Charles's successor, Louis XII. But Louis presented a problem. He was already married to Jeanne of France, the daughter of Louis XI. The solution was typically medieval in its cynical efficiency. Louis would seek an annulment from the Pope, claiming his marriage to Jeanne was invalid. The annulment process was a masterpiece of royal manipulation. Louis claimed that Jeanne was physically deformed and unable to consummate their marriage. Despite the fact that they had been married for 20 years, Jeanne, a pious woman who had never done anything but serve her husband faithfully, was dragged through public humiliation as intimate details of her body and their marriage were debated by church lawyers. Anne watched this proceeding with growing horror. She was seeing her own future played out in Jeanne's present. Royal women were not people, but problems to be solved, obstacles to be removed, resources to be redistributed. When Jeanne was finally cast aside and sent to a convent, Anne knew she was staring at her own potential fate. But Anne had learned something during her first marriage. She had discovered that even trapped queens could wield power if they were clever enough. When Louis XII came to claim her as his bride, Anne surprised everyone by negotiating. She agreed to marry Louis, but this time she demanded concessions. Brittany would retain certain autonomous privileges. She would have a say in the succession if they had children. Most importantly, she secured a promise that if Louis died before her, she would not be forced to marry his successor. She would be free to choose her own fate. The negotiations were a masterclass in royal diplomacy. Anne, now 22 and hardened by years of loss and betrayal, faced down the most powerful king in Europe and extracted promises that should have been impossible for a woman in her position. To obtain, she had learned to use her value as a political asset to carve out small spaces of autonomy within the prison of royal marriage. Her second wedding, held in 1499, was a far different affair from her first. Anne entered this marriage not as a conquered prize, but as a negotiating partner who had secured terms that protected her interests. She was still being forced to marry against her will, but she had managed to impose her own conditions on the arrangement. It was a small victory, but in the context of her life, small victories were everything. Louis XII proved to be a different kind of husband from Charles VIII. Where Charles had been brutal and impulsive, Louis was calculating and patient. He understood that Anne was not just a wife, but a political asset whose cooperation was essential to his success. Their marriage, while still fundamentally coercive, developed into something resembling a working partnership. Louis treated Anne with a respect that was born of pragmatism rather than affection. But it was still a vast improvement over her previous experience. Anne threw herself into her new role with fierce determination. She established a court culture that blended French sophistication with Breton traditions, created patronage networks that extended her influence throughout the kingdom, and began the delicate work of ensuring that Brittany retained its unique identity even within the French realm. But the ghosts of her lost children haunted every moment. Each pregnancy brought hope and terror in equal measure. She had learned to manage her expectations, to prepare for loss, even as she prayed for success. The armor she had developed was psychologically necessary but heartbreaking. A woman who had trained herself not to hope too much for her own children, in 1501, Anne gave birth to a daughter, Claude. The child lived, thrived, and became the light of Anne's life. For the first time in years, Anne experienced the joy of successful motherhood. But even this happiness was tinged with political reality. Claude was a daughter, not the son France desperately needed. Anne's subsequent pregnancies followed the familiar pattern of loss. Sons who lived only days, daughters who never drew breath, the endless cycle of hope and grief that defined royal motherhood. In an age of primitive medicine and political pressure, each loss was both personal tragedy and state crisis. Another, failure in Anne's primary duty as queen. The political implications of these losses were enormous. Without a male heir, the succession remained uncertain. Anne's failure to produce sons was seen by some as a divine judgment, a sign that perhaps the union of Brittany and France was not blessed by God, courtiers whispered. Foreign ambassadors sent coded messages to their masters. Anne felt the weight of an entire kingdom's future pressing down on her shoulders. But Anne had learned to find power in unexpected places. She became a patron of the arts, commissioning works that celebrated Breton culture and history. She established schools and hospitals, creating institutions that would outlast her own life. She carefully managed her daughter Claude's education, ensuring that the girl would be prepared for the brutal realities of royal life. In 1514, after 15 years of marriage to Louis XII, Anne faced her greatest test. Louis, now 52, and in poor health, was contemplating remarriage after Anne's death to secure the succession. The king, who had promised to honor their marriage contract, was already making contingency plans that would undo everything Anne had fought for. Anne's response was swift and decisive. She arranged for Claude to be betrothed to Francis of Angoulême, Louis's heir presumptive. It was a brilliant political move. By ensuring that Claude would marry the next king, Anne was securing both her daughter's future and Brittany's continued connection to the French throne. If Anne couldn't produce sons, she would at least ensure that her daughter's sons would rule. But the effort exhausted her. Years of political maneuvering, repeated pregnancies, and the constant stress of royal life had taken their toll. Anne's health began to fail in the winter of 1513. She was only 36, but she had lived several lifetimes' worth of tragedy and struggle. As she lay dying in the Château de Blois, Anne must have reflected on the impossibility of her situation. She had been forced to marry 3 times, had endured 14 pregnancies, had watched most of her children die, and had sacrificed her homeland's independence on the altar of political necessity. Yet, she had also negotiated unprecedented autonomy for a royal woman, had preserved elements of Breton culture, and had secured her daughter's future. The irony was profound. Anne, who had spent her life being passed from one husband to another, who had been treated as property rather than person, had somehow managed to become one of the most powerful women in European history. She had learned to work within the system that oppressed her, to find agency in the midst of subjugation, to protect what she could while accepting what she couldn't change. Anne died on January 9th, 1514, at the age of 36. Her last words were reported to be a prayer for Brittany, a final acknowledgement of the homeland she had been forced to sacrifice. The girl who had once stood in the towers of Nantes, watching enemy armies approach, had become a queen who shaped the destiny of nations. Even as she was shaped by forces beyond her control, her funeral was magnificent, befitting a queen who had ruled 2 kingdoms and influenced the fate of Europe. But perhaps the most fitting tribute came from the common people of Brittany, who lined the roads as her body made its final journey. They remembered her not as the queen who had married their conquerors, but as the daughter who had tried to save them, who had preserved what she could of their culture and identity. Anne's legacy is complex and multi-layered. She failed in her primary duty as defined by her era. She never produced the male heir that France desperately needed, but she succeeded in preserving elements of Breton culture, in advancing the cause of women's education and welfare, and in creating a template for how royal women could exercise agency within systems designed to deny them power. She transformed from victim to survivor, to someone who found ways to protect what mattered most, even when everything else was lost. The young girl who had stood in the tower at Nantes, watching enemy armies approach, could never have imagined the life that awaited her, but perhaps she would have recognized the strength it took to survive such a life, the courage required to keep fighting even when victory seemed impossible. Anne of Brittany was indeed a child queen forced to marry her executioner, but she was also something more, a woman who discovered that even in the darkest circumstances, even within the most restrictive systems, there are always small spaces where agency can flourish, where love can exist, where hope can survive. The girl in the tower became the woman who saved what she could of her world, who transformed conquest into negotiation, who turned survival into a form of victory. In the end, perhaps that's the most any of us can hope for, to face the forces that would destroy us and find ways to preserve what matters most, even when everything else is lost. The wind still blows through the towers of Nantes, carrying the salt scent of the sea and the whispered stories of those who came before. And sometimes, if you listen carefully, you can hear the echo of a young girl's voice, defiant and determined, promising that some things, love, hope, the memory of who we were, will endure long after the armies have passed and the conquerors have turned to dust.